This is Bible School Radio, KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth, KYJC, Commerce, and KMWC, Bethany. Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, how are banks helping those in financial trouble? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon, this is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, more U.S. retail bank customers are having trouble paying their bills on time. Jennifer White, Senior Director for Banking and Payments Intelligence at J.D. Power, is here to talk a little bit about it. Jennifer, so good to have you back on Prudent Money.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
You know, a lot of people have heard of J.D. Power and as far as consumer items go and that type of thing. Talk a little bit about what J.D. Power does and the research that you carry out.
J.D. Power is responsible for representing the voice of the consumer to today's industries, whether that's automotive, which many consumers know us as being a part of. It could be in healthcare. It could be talking to our consumer goods partners, airlines, and then it's talking to our financial institutions, whether that's wealth management, banking, lending, and even in credit card issuer space. Our job is to understand what the consumer needs are and make sure that industry is well aware of that.
You know, in past interviews that times I've had you on the program, you could see this situation with the consumer very quietly starting to deteriorate, kind of beneath the surface. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing.
Well, we've been measuring now for a solid 5 years the really financial health or the state of the U.S.'s consumer financial health. And what we are seeing is that in 2021, when we first started doing these metrics, about half of the consumer population was considered healthy. And by healthy, we mean, can you pay your bills on time? Do you have an emergency savings set up, ideally 6 months worth of that? Do you have access to credit when you need it? Is there some long-range savings in place? Are you adequately insured? The different things that kind of come together that, allow you to feel like you're positioned well, to feel satisfied with your personal financial condition. That number now, 5 years later, is down to about a third of the population being healthy. And there's really three ways that we see consumers' financial health declining. The consumers are telling us this. Actually, I shouldn't say that we see it this way. Consumers tell J.D. Power that the three things that really are changing are their ability to pay bills on time, whether or not they actually have that ideal 6 months emergency savings. That 6 months threshold might be a little high. And then their accessibility to credit, because too many consumers are currently using credit to bridge the gap that they might face on a month-to-month basis.
So y'all have been doing this specific research for the past 5 years. I mean, you said a third consider themselves healthy. Is that right?
I wouldn't say they consider themselves healthy. They answer a series of questions that we ask them that allow us to say that they fall into a healthy category.
Okay.
Actually, consumers might say, even consumers who are unhealthy, look, if they're on that hamster wheel and they're doing okay, they might consider themselves satisfied with their financial health. They might want it to be better, but they're doing all right. But when we take a look at objectively, either through the way that we ask those questions or our partners, at the in the financial world, there is the organization, the Office of the Comptroller, and they have vital signs. However we decide to look at it, we can tell that objectively consumers have less money in the bank, they're struggling to pay their bills on time, and have higher credit card debt.
Mm. Well, talk a little bit about, I know this is to some degree is kind of guessing, but talk a little bit about the comparison between the consumer who lived through the financial crisis in 2008?
You know, in J.D. Power's language, I don't have data that directly allows me to make that comparison for you. But what do we know to be different in terms of today's consumer? You know, they have the ability to have more information available at their fingertips than we even had in 2008. If you think about the fact that for most consumers, your bank is likely offering you free financial management tools. Which might be a tool that categorizes how you're spending your money. There are more resources available today that allow you to contact the lender and say, I'm falling on hard times and I need, 1 month's grace, or, obviously all of that comes with a cost. But a lot of the things that are available at customers' fingertips today were born out of the lessons that we learned in 2008.
Well, in your survey, you indicated that the younger bank customers have been asking for help and seeking advice from the big banks. Obviously, a great opportunity to build relationships, but somewhat of a challenge. After all, what kind of advice is the bank able to give?
Well, we have to think about advice as more than financial planning. We ask consumers what the topics they're most interested in are. And the 4 topics that they're most interested in today are not long-range planning topics that are related to investment needs or retirement.
Right.
They're actually things like quick tips on how to improve their financial situation today, ways to help save for emergencies, things like how do I identify recurring subscriptions that I could eliminate in order to free up money that's safe to save, tips on sticking to a budget, or maybe about how to set goals. What is a reasonable goal to set aside for, a specific large purchase? These are all short-run topics that, maybe there's information that can be conveyed in that topic space that maybe aren't quite as challenging as let's sit down and look at everything at once and come up with a full financial plan.
Yeah, it's more like a situation where, hey, I'm just trying to survive day to day right now. We'll let the future worry about itself when it gets here. Is that kind of the way to another way to say it?
Yeah, and that future planning might only be a year away once customers build trust in working with their bank on these short run topics. What I would love your listeners to really just know is that most of your banks are ready and prepared to have these short-run conversations. And we should be using those resources as consumers that are available to us because those banks are already our trusted partners.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. Jennifer White, Senior Director for Banking and Payments Intelligence at J.D. Power, is here to talk a little bit about what she's seeing and what their surveys are showing about the consumer right now. Your survey says that a good percentage of bank customers researched budgeting, but never really followed through. What do you think is the reason why they shy away from something that could create a lot of good financial foundation building today? Not necessarily something for the future, even though it does benefit the future.
Well, I think there's really 2 ways to think about the answer to that question. One is a psychology answer, and the other is a little more technical. So let's talk psych first, right? I think most consumers know that budgeting is a best practice. Budgeting can lead you to feeling empowered, even if you only have $20 to your name. The idea of knowing where that money is going, how you plan to spend it, allows you to just feel more in control of how you're managing your personal financial situation. But budgeting as a practice is also a reminder that you might be struggling. Tracking money causes anxiety for a whole lot of people. And perhaps even more than raising anxiety is this idea that if you set a budget and you're not able to stick to it, that impact of failure can create a shame spiral. It can cause shame that will keep some people from ever even starting. So there's a whole lot of people out there, especially if they do struggle a little bit more month to month or, in any sort of regular cadence, that say, do I have enough money to make doing this worthwhile? Is it just going to make me feel worse? Rather than, how I opened up this part of the conversation about budgeting leading to feelings of empowerment. So there's a psychological thing that's happening. Beyond psychological, and I'll stop there.
No. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, so beyond the psychological, the average consumer that's listening to this, to your program today, probably has 2 or 3 bank accounts. And because we don't have open banking, and for anybody listening who doesn't know what that means, because our banks aren't talking to each other, so that they can't share information with each other from one account to another, in order to do budgeting, you have to keep track across multiple accounts. And frankly, that's a lot of work for people to do. And I think that's a technical solution that keeps many consumers from really being able to sit down and say, okay, what's my true financial picture look like?
I should know this, but I'll have to say I don't. What percentage of the population do you think are running on more than one bank account? Different banks?
Oh, my goodness. I do know that number, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. It's a pretty high number. I mean,
it surprises me.
The mean score, I know on average, if I pulled it out, the average consumer has 2.3 accounts, right? Which means it's somewhere between 2 and 3. So it has to be a pretty high number, but I can't think of it off the top of my head.
That is, I would have never guessed that. I mean, I personally have always operated with one bank, and I've been with that bank forever. But it would just seem so much more difficult to juggle more than one bank.
Well, and banks want you as their customer, right? Because they want this idea of, they use the word primacy, where you view them as your primary partner. And anytime you need something new, a new mortgage, a new auto loan, anything in that space, you're going to look to them first. That's ideally what your bank wants to build with you. But we know that, especially in recent years, and particularly younger customers have gone rate searching. And so they might have a primary checking account where their direct deposit goes, but then they have a secondary account that maybe is a high yield account at possibly even a direct bank that's, where they're keeping that emergency savings if they have it. They might have a third account that's at, maybe a local credit union because they gave you a better rate on that auto loan. And so you have to transfer money over every month in order to make that payment. And the next thing you know, we have a little bit more diversification behind a single banking relationship.
And I want to go back to the to budgeting real quick and just make this comment. That's something we talk a lot about on the program. And one of the things that I've always said, no matter how painful it might feel, excuse me, once you get through the process, the chances of you feeling a lot more in control are going to be there. And that's the message that I definitely want people to get, is that there is a lot of value and there's a lot of wisdom in going through the process of budgeting.
There absolutely is. Even if you don't go so far as to then say to yourself, I'm going to track every penny I spend, at least going through the activity to figure out where your money is going today.
Yes,
so that first step, right, that spend categorization, it can leave you with such a sense of empowerment to just understand, no, I am not spending too much money on, on grapes at the grocery store. But, it just, that sense of empowerment is really worth the effort for many, many consumers.
Tell me this, how are banks, a little off subject, but how are banks handling the fact that the Fidelities and the Vanguards of the world can pay so much on these high yield money market accounts, and banks they're struggling to keep up with that?
Well, banks in that scenario need to be reminding their customer base pretty regularly what other value they get from that relationship.
Yes.
So, if all you're doing is transacting, depositing checks, transferring money, withdrawing cash, that's a harder conversation to have. But if you are, offering your customers tools that are automatically doing that spend categorization, like I just described,
Yes.
if you are making it easy to go online when you're, playing around on your phone and learn about the topics that we're talking about today, if you make it really easy to set an appointment to go talk to somebody at the bank about these types of about all of these topics, all those things add value that might make a customer say, I'm leaving my money with the bank rather than chasing 1 or 2 percentage points on those deposits.
Well, so let me ask you this: how's JD Power talk to banks about expanding their services, and of course talk about building relationships? But don't you have lower foot traffic because of technology today? So most people don't come into the bank.
What's really interesting about that is that we do know that it's empirical evidence that the banks tell the industry that foot traffic is lower. But if you talk to consumers about the frequency with which they're going in banks, we still see that the number of consumers that interacted with a branch in the last 3 months holds pretty steady. In fact, in some populations, it's increasing. If we say to consumers, if we ask them questions about how often they interact with a branch, maybe versus just using digital only, the percent of customers that are saying that they're digital only, like I don't want to have anything to do with branches anymore, has not increased in the last 4 years. It's staying pretty steady. So there's a lot of pundits out there that would say that branches are dead. And maybe the purpose of branches as a transactional building might be changing, but consumers are pretty clear in a variety of different ways that we ask questions here at JD Power. Consumers are pretty clear that branches still play a pretty important role in their lives.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I got to tell you that my bank is literally across the highway, and it takes me 5 minutes to get there. And I still to this day go into the bank when I need to go to the bank. I do everything because it's this relationship, and I think there's a lot of value there.
70% of U.S. consumers told JD Power last year that they had interacted with their branch in the last 3 months. 70%. And that's a still pretty high number. And big banks, Bank of America, Chase, large national banks are going all in this instance. They're opening more branches, not closing them. Many of them, Bank of America is the one that's just been in the news that's coming to mind lately. What they are doing is they're reimagining what the inside of that bank looks like. And gone is that wall with the glass, and the tellers standing behind it. They're open areas. They're sit-down conversational design. And, the people working there have tablets in their hands so that they can show you information. And, there is a reimagining of what it might look like inside those traditional brick buildings.
It's interesting. Bank of America, of course, they've got, I think they have one of the best technology setups for consumers. But they rank highest in customer service with retail banking advice. What y'all been working with the banks for a long time. What do you think were some of the bells and whistles that went off that said, "Hey, you got to make a change"?
So I think they made those bells and whistles. One of the things that differentiates Bank of America is they made the decision to organize really culturally around supporting customers in this way many years ago. So that allowed them over the course of a fair amount of time to really build this, I'll call it an ecosystem, right? Where they were one of the first institutions that allowed you to go online and make an appointment at the branch. I just talked about the investments that they're making in the branch design. They're one of the first that came to market with different financially supportive tools, like when you use your debit card, you can round up, and that round up from spending your debit card automatically will go into savings. They've built technological solutions like their product in Erica, which it's AI related, but it takes the chatbot experience and really helps answer questions for consumers. In general, they've built a lot of suite of tools. They have a lot of tools in their toolbox, and there's many other big banks that have similar tools in their toolboxes. But one of the things Bank of America does is they just talk about it more with their customers. We measure things like frequency, and we know that to delight a customer, the customers tell J.D. Power, they want to have at least 3 value-added interactions within the calendar year, like spread out, right? And that could be just a really good email teaching a customer. It could be an interruption in the, while you're in the mobile app warning you about a scam. It could be a good conversation at a branch, so it isn't all, personal service here. But they're just doing more of it. They're best in class on hitting that 3 or more experiences within a calendar year. They're just doing more than some of their competitors are doing.
Most big banks have a financial advising division. How much are the banks relying on the financial advisor portion of the banking industry to educate and build those relationships?
Wealth planning, advisor relationships, that's an important part of the business for many institutions. But a lot of the information I've been sharing with you all today is really based on customers who don't have dedicated financial advisors. The affluent population still remains and will always be very important to banks. They're going to have higher deposit levels, right? And serving them. But, what is important to realize is that those advisors, that type of relationship where you are focused on really building trust, that's been a lesson as each of these banks have been rolling out programs to help customers support their financial health.
Last question, Jennifer. How much concern is there about bank fraud, ID theft, and how are you guys going about measuring that?
Oh, my goodness. I like to say there's 3 things that consumers are worried about most, and it's 3 F words: fees, fairness, and fraud. So bank fraud is increasing. The last measurement I have says that within the last 12 months, 29% of bank customers have experienced some form of financial fraud in the last year. And of that 29%, about half of them have actually had more than one experience within the year. This is a big deal. And so we're measuring it through a study we call our Financial Protection Satisfaction Study that's measuring customer satisfaction. Again, we're going to bring the voice of the customer to the industry with how well banks and card issuers are doing at protecting accounts ahead of even having a fraud experience. What are the best practices in guiding customers through ensuring their accounts are set up to be as safe and secure as they can be? Hint to everybody listening right now, just checking your statements isn't quite enough. Do things like make sure you have the most recent mobile app downloaded, and have you set up 2-factor authentication? Sure, it adds friction, but that friction has a purpose. So we measure that, and we're also then asking customers who've gone through recent fraud which banks are doing the best job at helping get to a resolution. And resolution is more than just either giving you your money back or sending you a new card in the mail. It's, reminding you where you do have recurring charges so that makes it easier for you to go clean up the mess, right?
Maybe we should have started with bank fraud and ID theft. That's a big subject. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the program. Once again, jdpower.com is the website. If you can go check it out. And we'll talk to you again sometime soon.
I always love chatting with you. Thanks for having me.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. What a job a company like J.D. Power has to help the banking industry. Can you just imagine the trust factor? Fortunately, there really hasn't been any things that have happened as of late. Wells Fargo's been pretty quiet, unusually quiet. Maybe that's a sign of something's about to happen. But to rebuild that trust, that's got to be a big one. If you have a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.